Today, we're going to examine the climb where two Sherpas knew this rich couple was going to die. The climb shifted when the Sherpas realized the couple made a decision that quietly erased their last margin for survival. The events that came next would haunt everyone present on the mountain. It was May 3rd, 2015, at Camp 2 on Cho Oyu, the world's 6th highest mountain, where the morning air held a crystalline clarity that made the summit appear deceptively close. The camp sat at 21,300 feet on a relatively flat section of glacier tucked beneath the massive southwest face that rose another 5,500 vertical feet above. Temperatures hovered around -10 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that breath froze instantly into ice crystals, but warm enough that climbers moved between tents without full expedition gear. The sky stretched overhead in that particular shade of deep blue that only existed above 20,000 feet, where atmosphere thinned to a fraction of sea level density. Prayer flags strung between camps snapped in the wind, their colors brilliant against the white and gray landscape. Among the dozen expeditions staged at Camp 2 was a private operation that had attracted attention from the moment it arrived at base camp 3 weeks earlier. The clients were Marcus and Jennifer Ashford, ages 51 and 47, from Greenwich, Connecticut. Marcus had built and sold a hedge fund in 2013 for a sum he described to anyone who asked as north of $180 million. The exit had funded what the couple called their transformation, a shift from Wall Street careers to adventure pursuits that demonstrated commitment to experiences over accumulation. They trained with personal trainers 5 days per week, completed 2 marathons, and maintained body fat percentages in the athletic range. Their climbing resume consisted of a guided summit of Mount Rainier 18 months earlier and a trek to Kilimanjaro's summit the previous year. Both experiences had been documented extensively on social media, where Jennifer's account had accumulated nearly 40,000 followers interested in her narrative about redefining success after corporate life. Cho Oyu represented the next chapter in that narrative. The couple had paid $140,000 for a private expedition, nearly triple the cost of joining a standard commercial group. The fee covered exclusive Sherpa support, customized logistics, and the flexibility to operate on their own schedule rather than coordinating with larger teams. Their stated goal was to prove that high-altitude mountaineering was accessible to people who approached it with proper preparation and mental discipline, regardless of technical climbing background. What they lacked was any understanding of how altitude affected human physiology beyond what could be learned in spreadsheets and training logs. The Sherpas assigned to the Ashfords were Phurba Tamang, 37, and his cousin Ngima Lama, 29, both from Namche Bazaar. Phurba had summited Cho Oyu 9 times across 15 years of guiding. His face showed the characteristic weathering of long-term, high-altitude work, deep creases around his eyes from decades of glacier glare, skin darkened and toughened by constant exposure to cold and wind. He supported a family of 5, including a 9-year-old daughter who had been diagnosed with a congenital heart condition requiring surgery in Kathmandu. The procedure was scheduled for July and would cost approximately $8,000, an amount that represented nearly 2 years of typical Sherpa income. Phurba had exactly enough saved if this expedition paid out as contracted, and if he completed 2 additional climbs before the season ended. Ngima had completed 4 Cho Oyu summits and was engaged to be married in September. The wedding, planned for his home village, required funds that exceeded what his family could contribute. His guiding income over the past 2 seasons had built the necessary amount, but the margin was thin. Walking away from a $7,500 payment, split between the 2 men, would force postponement and create complications with his fiancée's family that extended beyond simple financial embarrassment. Before the first acclimatization rotation began, the Ashfords underwent the standard pre-rotation medical screening at advanced base camp. The process was brief and procedural, designed less to exclude clients than to document that basic checks had been performed. A Nepali expedition medic recorded resting heart rates, blood pressure, and oxygen saturation readings, while climbers sat bundled in down jackets outside the medical tent. The numbers were logged, signed, and added to a folder that would rarely be opened again unless something went catastrophically wrong. Marcus's resting oxygen saturation at base camp measured 86%, low but still within a range that expedition medics saw regularly at that altitude, and not low enough to trigger an automatic halt. His heart rate hovered persistently above 90 beats per minute, even after 15 minutes of rest, a sign that his cardiovascular system was already compensating harder than it should have been. Jennifer's numbers were marginally better, but she reported difficulty sleeping, frequent headaches, and a lingering shortness of breath during simple tasks like dressing or walking between tents. None of these findings disqualified them. On paper, they passed. Sherpa watched the screening from a distance, recognizing the familiar pattern. Base camp medical checks were designed to catch obvious emergencies, not to predict who would fail. Higher up, they could identify infections, severe illness, or immediate danger, but they could not measure how a client's brain or lungs would respond once oxygen levels dropped further. What mattered more, the slow adaptation of capillaries, the ability to ventilate efficiently, the neurological resilience under hypoxic stress, could not be assessed in a 10-minute exam. Marcus interpreted the results as validation. The medic had not stopped him. No one had used the word dangerous. To Marcus, the absence of prohibition meant approval. He referenced the numbers later when concerns were raised, pointing out that he had been medically cleared and that his training metrics at home were excellent. Jennifer echoed the sentiment, framing the screening as evidence that their preparation had been sufficient and that any discomfort ahead would simply be part of the process. Sherpa understood the unspoken rule governing private expeditions. Wealthy clients were not screened out unless failure was undeniable. Operators avoided confrontations that could cost future business. And Sherpas learned quickly that raising objections too early branded them as difficult rather than responsible. The paperwork existed to protect companies after accidents, not to prevent them. Once the forms were signed and the payments secured, the mountain was allowed to decide what the vetting process would not. By the time the Ashfords clipped into their harnesses for the first move toward Camp 1, Sherpa already knew the margin was thin. The numbers had not warned loudly enough. The system had done exactly what it was designed to do: allow the climb to proceed. The problems had begun during the first acclimatization rotation to Camp 1 at 19,200 feet. The climb required ascending approximately 1,900 vertical feet from advanced base camp over moderate terrain, steep enough to require front pointing with crampons in sections, but straightforward for anyone with basic mountaineering skills. Strong climbers completed the ascent in 3 to 4 hours. Jennifer required 8 hours and 20 minutes. Her pace dropped to 15 steps, followed by extended rest periods, her breathing rapid and shallow even during pauses. Sherpa stayed with her the entire way, watching her coordination deteriorate as altitude stress accumulated. She stumbled repeatedly on terrain that should not have challenged anyone wearing crampons properly. Her movements became increasingly uncoordinated, each step requiring visible concentration. Marcus's oxygen saturation at Camp 1 measured 66% at rest, a number that alarmed Sherpa immediately. At that altitude, even poorly acclimatized climbers typically maintained readings in the low 70s. 66% indicated Marcus's body was failing to process oxygen efficiently, a warning sign that continuing upward would push him into dangerous hypoxia. When Sherpa explained this and recommended descending for additional acclimatization days before attempting higher camps, Marcus responded that the numbers were being interpreted through outdated protocols. He had researched altitude physiology extensively during his training and believed individual variation meant strict thresholds were unnecessarily conservative. His body felt strong. He was continuing upward. The couple spent 2 nights at Camp 1, then insisted on moving to Camp 2, despite Sherpa's recommendation for additional rest. The climb required ascending another 2,100 vertical feet over terrain that became progressively steeper and more exposed. Jennifer's pace remained dangerously slow, requiring nearly 7 hours for an ascent that should have taken 4. At Camp 2, both clients immediately disappeared into their tent and did not emerge until the following afternoon. When they did appear, they presented Sherpa with a list of modifications they wanted implemented: a larger tent with more interior space, specific meal preparations that differed from standard expedition food, and additional rest days built into the schedule before attempting higher camps. The critical incident occurred on their 3rd night at Camp 2. Jennifer removed the oxygen mask. Sherpa had insisted she use intermittently during the night because the straps irritated her face and the hissing sound prevented rest. Supplemental oxygen at that altitude was not standard practice. Most climbers relied on acclimatization rather than bottled gas below Camp 3. but Jennifer's poor adaptation had pushed Sherpa to treat it as an emergency tool rather than a comfort. Without the brief intervals, her oxygen saturation dropped through the night as her body struggled to process the thin air. The following morning, she emerged from the tent exhibiting clear signs of high-altitude cerebral edema in its early stages. Her movements were uncoordinated, her balance uncertain. She stumbled while walking on flat ground between tents. Her speech was slightly slurred, words coming slowly and with visible effort. When Sherpa asked her to perform a simple heel-to-toe walk test, a standard field assessment for ataxia, she could not maintain balance for more than 3 steps. Combined with her slurred speech and the glassy, unfocused way she tracked movement around her, the failure removed any doubt. These symptoms, paired with her persistent headache and nausea, indicated that fluid was accumulating in her brain tissue. The condition would worsen rapidly if she remained at altitude. Descent was the only effective treatment. Sherpa explained this carefully, laying out the medical progression and the consequences of continuing upward. Jennifer's response came sharp and immediate. She felt fine aside from expected altitude discomfort. The Sherpas were applying standards inconsistently, treating her differently because she did not fit the typical climber profile. She had not paid $140,000 to be told she could not summit by guides whose job was to help her reach her goal. Marcus supported her position completely, adding that they had signed comprehensive liability waivers specifically to maintain decision-making authority over their own climb. The expedition's western leader, a British guide named Simon, who had been hired primarily to manage logistics and provide legitimacy to the operation, deferred to the clients. His contract specified that he served in an advisory capacity, and the Ashfords retained final authority over all decisions. When Sherpa pressed the issue privately, Simon acknowledged the concerns but noted that attempting to force clients down against their will created its own complications. They were adults who had accepted responsibility for the risks. Unless Jennifer became unable to walk or communicate, the decision remained hers. Quick reminder, if this kind of in-depth breakdown matters to you, subscribing helps keep these stories coming. Now let's get back to the mountain. The second acclimatization rotation to Camp 3 at 23,600 feet revealed the full scope of their inadequacy. The route climbed 2,300 vertical feet up increasingly steep terrain where fixed ropes provided security but could not compensate for poor technique or failing physiology. Marcus fell twice on moderate ground, losing his balance and catching himself on the fixed line before the falls became serious. Both incidents occurred on terrain that should not have challenged anyone with basic crampon skills. Sherpa recognized the falls as symptoms of deteriorating coordination, early signs that Marcus's brain was not receiving adequate oxygen to maintain fine motor control. Jennifer's persistent cough worsened into something more concerning. The sound was wet and rattling, each exhale producing a gurgling quality that indicated fluid accumulation in her lungs. At Camp 3, Sherpa listened to her breathing with a stethoscope from his medical kit and heard crackles in the lower lung fields, the characteristic sound of high-altitude pulmonary edema developing. Combined with her elevated heart rate, her breathing difficulty even at rest, and the pink-tinged sputum she tried to conceal, the diagnosis was clear. Her lungs were filling with fluid as capillaries leaked under the stress of extreme altitude. Like cerebral edema, the condition was immediately life-threatening and would worsen rapidly without descent. That evening, Sherpa and Ngima discussed abandoning the expedition. They sat outside their tent after the clients had retired, speaking quietly in Nepali. Ngima stated plainly that continuing would result in the deaths of one or both clients. The warning signs had progressed beyond concerning to critical. They were no longer guiding a climb. They were supervising a double suicide. Sherpa agreed completely, but saw no path forward that did not destroy them financially and professionally. Walking away would forfeit their payment immediately. The contract specified that Sherpas who refused to continue for reasons other than objective hazards, avalanche danger, storm conditions, equipment failure, would receive no compensation for work completed beyond the immediate financial loss. Abandoning wealthy Western clients created reputational damage that spread quickly through the tight network of expedition operators. Sherpas who were labeled as difficult or unwilling to accommodate client preferences found themselves unemployed regardless of their experience or safety record. The industry operated on referrals and relationships, and clients like the Ashfords had the resources and connections to ensure their version of events dominated any narrative. The Ashfords themselves created additional pressure through their behavior toward the Sherpas. They demanded that Sherpa and Ngima carry personal items that exceeded standard loads, camera equipment, extra clothing layers, comfort items that served no safety function. They referred to the Sherpas as our team in social media posts, language that reduced experienced mountaineers to support staff. They interrupted safety briefings, ignored recommendations about pacing and hydration, and treated medical concerns as obstacles to be dismissed rather than warnings to be heeded. The pattern revealed how they understood their relationship to the people whose labor and expertise made their climb possible. On May 18th, the weather forecast showed a stable high-pressure system arriving within 36 hours. Wind speeds above 24,000 feet would drop to 15 miles per hour, temperatures would moderate slightly, and visibility would remain excellent. The conditions represented a legitimate summit window. Expedition teams across Cho Oyu began finalizing their pushes. The Ashfords insisted on attempting the summit despite unanimous recommendations from Sherpa, Ngima, and Simon that they abort the climb entirely. Their acclimatization had been inadequate. Their physical condition had deteriorated rather than improved, and the symptoms both had exhibited indicated their bodies were failing under altitude stress. Marcus responded that they had traveled too far and invested too much to turn back based on excessive caution. Jennifer added that plenty of climbers felt terrible at altitude and still summited successfully. They were continuing, with or without Sherpa support. The economic reality left Sherpa and Ngima with no viable options but to refuse. Sherpa's daughter's surgery was scheduled in 7 weeks. Ngima's wedding was planned for September. Both men had families whose financial security depended on the income that high-altitude guiding provided. They prepared equipment for the summit push, knowing they were facilitating something that would likely end in death. The departure from Camp 3 occurred at 11:30 p.m. on May 18th, under a sky dense with stars. The temperature had dropped to minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that exposed skin froze in seconds but manageable with proper layering. The route climbed directly up the upper slopes of Cho Oyu's southwest face, 3,200 vertical feet of sustained effort at altitudes where the oxygen saturation dropped below levels that could sustain consciousness without supplemental gas. Marcus required physical assistance within the first hour. His pace had slowed to a crawl, 10 steps followed by minutes of rest, his breathing rapid and shallow, even while stationary. Sherpa positioned himself directly behind Marcus, one hand on his harness, effectively supporting a portion of his weight, while Marcus front-pointed up the steep sections. The arrangement meant Sherpa was climbing for 2 people at an altitude where his own body was struggling to maintain basic function. Jennifer's oxygen supply became a critical issue at 24,500 feet. She had maxed out her flow rate, 4 liters per minute, double the standard setting, and was burning through her bottles far faster than planned. At that rate, her oxygen would be exhausted before reaching the summit, and she would face the descent without supplemental gas at altitudes where bottled oxygen often meant the difference between walking down and dying. When Ngima explained this and recommended turning back immediately, Jennifer responded that she would manage without it if necessary. She had not come this far to quit. The turnaround time of 2 a.m. passed without the clients acknowledging it. Turnaround times existed as hard limits, specifically because summit fever, the overwhelming desire to reach the top regardless of consequences, impaired judgment more reliably than altitude itself. Climbers who violated turnaround times died at predictable rates, either on the descent when exhaustion and darkness combined, or during the night when they could not reach lower camps before their bodies failed. Sherpa stated clearly that they needed to descend. Marcus and Jennifer continued climbing. By 25,000 feet, both Sherpas recognized they were no longer guiding a climb. They were babysitting clients who had entered the active process of dying, moving upward through the final hours before their bodies shut down completely. Marcus's coordination had deteriorated to the point where Sherpa was half carrying him, supporting his weight during each step while Marcus's legs trembled with exhaustion. Jennifer's breathing had become labored and wet, each exhale producing sounds that indicated her lungs were filling rapidly with fluid. Her oxygen supply showed red, nearly empty, and she had more than 1,800 vertical feet remaining to the summit with no reserve for the descent. Jennifer collapsed at 26,100 feet, approximately 800 vertical feet below the summit. She sat down in the snow, her movements slow and uncoordinated, and did not respond when Ngima tried to get her moving again. Her eyes were unfocused, her breathing shallow and irregular. Within minutes, she slumped sideways and lost consciousness completely. Ngima checked for a pulse at her neck and found it rapid and weak, her heart racing to compensate for oxygen deprivation, even as her blood pressure dropped, and her core systems began shutting down. He tried to rouse her, speaking directly into her ear, shaking her shoulder, attempting anything that might bring her back to awareness. She did not respond. Marcus continued upward alone, either unaware or unwilling to stop for his wife's collapse. Sherpa stayed with Jennifer while Ngima followed Marcus, unwilling to let him climb completely unsupported into terrain where a single mistake meant death. Marcus reached 26,400 feet before he sat down in the snow and refused to move. His face was pale beneath his oxygen mask, his movements slow and mechanical. When Ngima reached him and explained they needed to descend immediately, Marcus stared at him without comprehension. His eyes were glassy, his expression distant. He had entered the final stage of cerebral hypoxia, the point where cognition collapsed and survival instinct failed. Ngima tried to help Marcus stand, pulling on his harness, supporting his weight, attempting to get his legs moving. Marcus pushed him away with surprising strength, then became limp and unresponsive. Ngima checked his pulse and found it erratic, beating fast, then slow, the rhythm inconsistent as Marcus's heart struggled to function without adequate oxygen. He repositioned Marcus's oxygen mask, opened the flow fully, and tried to stimulate breathing by clearing ice from the valve and keeping Marcus upright against the slope, but the altitude made every movement slow and punishing, and Marcus's condition continued deteriorating. Below, Jennifer had stopped breathing entirely. Sherpa confirmed the absence of pulse, the absence of chest movement, and the complete stillness that indicated death. Her body remained where it had fallen, her face peaceful beneath the oxygen mask, the mountain having taken her exactly as Sherpa had warned weeks earlier at Camp 2. Marcus died at 26,300 feet during Ngima's attempts to drag him downward. His pulse stopped, his breathing ceased, and nothing Ngima could do at that altitude could restart systems that had failed completely. Ngima remained with the body for nearly 20 minutes before accepting what could not be changed. Two bodies at 26,000 feet in the death zone could not be recovered by two exhausted Sherpas operating at the limits of their own survival. Descent was the only option. Sherpa and Ngima reached Camp 3 by mid-morning on May 19th and reported the deaths to base camp by radio, providing coordinates and a brief account of what had happened. A recovery attempt was organized days later, but the bodies were deemed unrecoverable due to altitude and terrain. Marcus and Jennifer Ashford remain on Cho Oyu's upper slopes, among the bodies marking the mountain's death zone. The investigation later concluded the deaths were caused by high-altitude cerebral and pulmonary edema, inadequate acclimatization, and repeated refusals to descend. Legal action threatened by the Ashford family was dismissed after records confirmed the warnings given. Sherpa continued guiding, but stopped accepting private clients. Ngima left high-altitude climbing entirely, later opening a lower-altitude trekking company in the Khumbu Valley. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more?